I think, and we've seen, obviously, Arizona has been a leader on education policy for years. And so something like academic transparency, which just this past legislative session, sponsored by Senator Nancy Bartow, had the support of the governor, passed through the state Senate, and came within a single vote of passing in the House. And so I think, as we've seen nationally, calls for this sort of legislation, Arizona was on the cutting edge of this frontier of putting parents first. And so I think that that legislation that nearly crossed the finish line this past session, I think we're likely to see increasing support and enthusiasm for that as parents are increasingly, again, saying this is something that is a priority for us. So we've seen grassroots, we've seen parents, we've seen even teachers come out and say, look, this sort of content, this sort of legislative content is imperative because right now the status quo is failing not only students but also teachers. So for instance, with academic transparency, we're seeing teachers who are expected, new teachers, to come into the classroom and be tasked with building their classroom from the ground up, spending hours each week scouring the internet looking for content to use, even as their school district is paying curriculum coaches and all sorts of other staffers, and we're essentially putting an extra load on our teachers. So something like transparency says, if you're a bright, innovative, hardworking young teacher who wants to come into the classroom, you're going to have that flexibility to help foster your craft, but you're also going to be able to look and see what are other veteran great teachers doing, and can you help borrow from some of those materials as an anchor for your materials. So transparency, I think, is a major piece of what we're going to see. There are other initiatives that I think Arizona also is going to continue to look forward to, and that's ensuring that the content that is in our schools is quality, right? So we've seen measures that would help provide protections and guardrails around the content that our public schools are using to make sure that they're not pushing things like critical race theory, to say that we should differentiate among students based upon race or treat them differently in our hiring protocols. So legislation that Goldwater supported this past year that we'll again support is to say our public schools and our universities should not be screening applicants either based upon their race or their commitment to CRT or so-called diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives that essentially boil down to, will you treat students differently, will you judge them differently based upon race, and instead make sure that you're bringing on educators whose merit and commitment to their craft is the defining reason as to whether or not they're put in front of students. That's a great question. So I think folks who support educational freedom, school choice, ultimately recognize that these things are not a sort of winner-take-all and not a zero-sum kind of game, right? It's not to say that by promoting one alternative over here, you're closing a door or preventing something else. So at Goldwater, we support and helped pioneer the ESA program here in Arizona. We also support the tax credit scholarship program, charter schools, whatever opportunity that a family wants to pursue ultimately is up to that family. So even if there are different organizations that may be prioritizing a specific piece of legislation in one legislative session, again, these proposals are not mutually exclusive, right? So if the charter schools are working on something to promote flexibility on their side and folks on the tax credit scholarship are looking for reforms of those programs, both of those options can be strengthened at the same time. And so I think that we tend to see among the unions, among the education establishment, this idea that there's a one-size-fits-all, there's one monopoly, and that anything that destabilizes that, anything that might say you don't get to control and dictate where kids are going to go, they view that as a threat. I think reformers who look at this and say, if a family wants to choose a charter school, that's great. If they want to have access to an ESA and go to a micro school, if a family wants to pursue homeschooling, whatever that option might be, none of these things are in conflict with each other. And so I think that that provides a sort of starting point for reformers to look at and say, sure, we may be focused on one area or another more than another group, but at the end of the day, you tend to find a lot of folks who are supportive of these policies broadly. So even if someone is working on one area, they're going to be supportive of the mission and philosophy behind the other. And so that's something that I think actually breeds a sense of collaboration as opposed to some sort of conflict or competition in that sense.